Welcome, I'm Hagen Blix, and together with Zeerak Talat, I'm going to present our paper on the machine learning of ethical judgments from natural language. This is joint work with Josef Valvoda, Indira Ganesh, Ryan Cotterell, and Adina Williams. You may remember that last year, machine learning once again made it into the media and gave rise to headlines such as "Scientists build an AI to give ethical advice, but it turned out super racist." What had happened, Zhang et al. Published a paper and a model called Delphi, which essentially attempts to use machine learning towards ethics. The model takes as its input the textual description of a situation and outputs an ethical judgment. The authors faced a big Twitter shitstorm, a lot of media coverage, much of which was negative. I recommend that you read their post-release reflections on these situations. The model has undergone some slight changes. Again, you can read about this on their homepage. What we want to focus here is on the nature of the response and give a different response to this. Essentially, the media response and the Twitter shitstorms focused on concrete examples. In particular, focused on tricking the model into saying racist and sexist and genocidal things. So the media response essentially, if we want to put it more technically, has focused on the question of what is an unacceptably low accuracy in the domain of ethics. And in contrast, what we want to do here is focus on the nature of the task. And we want to say that essentially there is a mismatch between the nature of the task and the alleged aim of the task, insofar as the aim is allegedly descriptive, but the task and the way they have conceived it produces normative results. And then we're going to argue that a normative model of ethics that is not a person is a fundamental category error, and that such a model is unsafe at any accuracy, regardless of the score. All right, let's jump into what is the nature of a moral judgment. Let's take something like Sue believes that killing a bear is wrong. We can say a moral judgment consists of three essential parts: Sue, an entity, a proposition such as killing a bear, and a judgment such as wrong. And if we want to formalize this in some kind of logical structure, we can think about a moral judgment as being a function that takes as its input pairs of entities and propositions and maps them onto a judgment. Now, what does Delphi do? Delphi takes as its input a proposition such as killing a bear, and as its output a judgment. So Delphi drops the entity that provides the judgment. And this is akin to what Donna Haraway called the God trick, namely suggesting that a particular view is a universal view, the view from nowhere, right? By hiding the entity that holds the belief, it appears universal. Why is this important? It's important because this difference maps exactly onto the difference between what is a descriptive statement and what is a prescriptive statement. Something like Sue believes that killing a bear is wrong is a claim about a fact in the actual world, or what Hume called an is statement. In this case, it's a statement about Sue's beliefs. In contrast, killing bears is wrong is a prescriptive statement. It's a claim about the desirability or undesirability of a possible world, or what Hume would have called an odd statement. Now, what are some other differences between descriptive and prescriptive statements, and how is this relevant to their methodology? Descriptive methodologies in science are about describing their object of study. So if we want to do descriptive ethics, we are usually interested in how population-level variables may influence the mapping, right? So a descriptive study that I could ask is, what is the role of religion in people's belief about abortion in people older than 60 versus people younger than 30, right? Those would be two variables that I could study in their influence on the judgment about a particular proposition, right? So we take all these three objects, the entities, the propositions, and the judgments, and we study how particular variables, independent variables, may influence the outcome. That's a descriptive methodology. It is about the population in some crucial sense. Descriptive methodologies generally have to be justified, if they're new, by saying they improve in certain respects over existing ones, right? So if we want to use machine learning towards this task, we should explain why this is better than traditional existing methodologies such as surveys or behavioral experiments or an anthropological study, and so on. Descriptive methodologies also may require IRB approval. Kaushik et al. Have recently written a very relevant paper about this. And finally, a crucial point is that descriptive statements do not endorse the content of the judgment, right? I can tell you that Sue believes that killing bears is wrong without having any personal opinions about killing bears is wrong. A hunter who loves killing bears and environmentalist who believes that killing bears is awful could equally well tell you that Sue believes that killing bears is wrong, right? No endorsement is entailed. Now, prescriptive statements are not like that. Prescriptive statements, which are about the desirability of a possible world, are inherently normative. They are about what the world ought to be like. And the judgment is necessarily endorsed. It doesn't make any sense for me to say killing bears is wrong, but I don't have an opinion on killing bears. Right? That is a nonsensical statement. So the statement killing bears is wrong, the kind of statements that Delphi outputs, are inherently prescriptive. That is part of what we're calling a category error. The task, as it's designed, is a pretty questionable approach to the beliefs of certain crowd workers. It's particularly questionable because it doesn't actually describe the population. However, the model's outputs, due to the God trick, end up being prescriptive. So we get it going from an is statement, in which we hide the entity, to an ought statement, something that is known as Hume's guillotine, and has been argued to be not logically possible. Now, what do we think ethics is? We think ethics is an open-ended, ongoing socio-political process. In democracies, we believe it should be debate-based, historically, of course, and concurrently. Frequently, these kinds of processes involve violence and other non-democratic means. Crucially, we want ethics to be debate-based, and such a process requires participants who can be in a debate. That requires that participant can contest something. It requires that participants can be held accountable. Now, in the absence of artificial general intelligence, a model is not a participant. It cannot be argued with. I cannot contest something that the model says. I cannot argue with the model, and the model cannot argue with me. And that is essentially the crucial category error. And why is this important? Well, historically, lots of beliefs, as John Stuart Mill pointed out in 1871, they are very common for a certain age and subsequently become so palpable an absurdity that the only difficult thing then is to imagine how such a thing can ever have appeared credible. Right? We can think about the criminalization of homosexuality in many Western countries, which only stopped a few decades ago. And that is why averaging beliefs in the way that a machine learning model does is not an approximation for debate, and the notion of accuracy is misplaced. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Zeerak.
Thank you, Hagen. I want to highlight 3 critiques of machine learning for ethical decision-making, which follow from what we've discussed so far. First, models have no agency, which means that models cannot be contested, and the responsibility is diffused. As Hagen mentioned, the God trick is applied, which means that models for predicting morality take a universal view, which assumes that there's a global unanimous consensus on the predictions made. Its agency refers to the ability to make decisions independently. We don't think that models make decisions independently, but rather they make them as a function of correlations that seek to minimize output error. This lack of agency has a knock-on effect that we can't contest the models, and that the responsibility of the classification is diffused. For instance, if a model trained on MIT's moral machine decides that it's acceptable to kill pedestrians, we are left without recourse to contest that decision. We cannot debate or reason with the model to let it know that its decision is unacceptable. Through foreclosing this debate, we undermine the essential social functions of ethical decision making. Moreover, morality and ethics are not invariant to time or place. Models, however, are. The model trained today will make the same prediction 10, 15 years from now. Finally, by obscuring agency, we also obscure who is accountable for a decision. when Delphi evaluated that being a Black woman was less morally acceptable than being a white man? Was it the system, the developers, Allen AI and the University of Washington, who are responsible and accountable for this eugenicist proposal wrapped up as moral judgment? When we can't hold an entity to account, we digress into uncertain terrain for people, and we lose our ability to affect change. What we know is that many machine learning systems are developed by corporations that seek to distribute responsibility onto other entities because of the impacts on their reputation and their bottom line. In the case of car crashes in autonomous vehicles, we already see that drivers are held responsible for decisions made by the machine. Is this really something we'd want to propagate into more aspects of our society? We don't think so. Although we don't believe that there's any future in which moral decision-making should be optimized, we hold that any endeavors to use machine learning to understand morality and ethics and moral position should only be undertaken by multidisciplinary teams that hold the expertise in the fields that are relevant to the inquiry. And while projects such as Delphi imagine a future where the human is removed from the process, we hold that future work should instead seek to more deeply engage with people and more purposefully seek to improve the lived realities of the people affected by the technologies. In short, we hold that future work should seek to center the people affected by technologies, and the work should be performed by professionals who are competent within the fields that are explored. With that, we'd like to thank you all for your attention and to the many people who've given us feedback on our work.